Hello and welcome to today's virtual Chelsea Ask a Gardening Advisor session, where we will all be answering your questions on the topic of wildlife and the garden environment. Now, today's questions are all about how to encourage wildlife into the garden and how to garden environmentally, how to choose plants for difficult spaces. I'm Chris Beardshaw, but you don't really want to hear from me. It's the enlightened, the illuminated who are here to answer all of your questions. So Leigh, would you like to give us an introduction? Tell everyone who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Leigh Hunt, Principal Horticulture Advisor at the RHS, and I have a special interest in what benefits plants can give us, particularly those environmental benefits.
Fantastic. Charlotte, why don't you have a go at filling the world full of all of your skills and talents and your accolades?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Sweeney. I'm a horticultural advisor with the RHS, and I'm based up at Harlow Carr in Yorkshire, where I have a terrace garden in Harrogate, so I like growing in containers.
And Harrogate, of course, just one of those places where wherever you go in Harrogate, it's about filling containers and seasonal bedding as well. If you want to go anywhere in the world and see some fabulous seasonal bedding, then Harrogate's a great place to start, isn't it?
Definitely. It looks gorgeous this year, even with lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. Great weather for it. And Helen, how about yourself? Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Helen Bostock and I'm a wildlife gardening advisor at the RHS. So I work really closely with our science teams on things like the RHS Plants for Pollinators list and any research that we are undertaking into biodiversity in gardens.
Okay, so a veritable bevy of gardening experts who are there to answer all of the questions. And we've had plenty of questions coming in that really encompass everything about gardens and wildlife and interacting with wildlife, all the sorts of challenges that we all typically have. All positive, I have to say, not a single one about getting rid of wildlife from the garden. It's all about introducing wildlife into the garden, which is fabulously positive. So if we start the questions, question one is from Nancy Gregson, who is in Warwickshire. And Nancy says, I don't have a particularly large garden, but would like to have a few trees of wildlife value. Trees that grow up to 7 or 8 meters would be suitable. Any suggestions, panel? So Leigh, what do you think? What would be suitable for a small garden, sort of 7, 8 meters, something like that?
Yeah, I really rate things like the rowans, and these rowans, well, they have wonderful dissected foliage, and in the autumn you get these fantastic berries. So these are kind of orangey red in colour, big clusters, and they obviously are loved by birds. There are a number of different cultivars, so you can go on something like Joseph Rock, which is yellow, or the one I've got in my own garden, which is pink pagoda. But I have to say it's the red ones that the birds really like. If I have to choose something else, then I'd go for a kind of form of our native hawthorn, so Crataegus prunifolia. Now, being called prunifolia, it looks more like the shape of leaf that you would get with a prunus, or something you'd expect from something like a plum, so more rounded in effect. That's a little bit more glossy, has white flowers, a little bit like a hawthorn, but smaller, daintier clusters, and then again, good shots of red fruits in the autumn that the birds love.
It's got great thorns as well, hasn't it? It's a really thorny plant. So if you want something which has a real character about it, does have that big personality. Have you ever tried to make anything out of the fruits? Because there is a rumor that in North America, where parents are from, that the fruits were harvested and dried and ground up into a kind of paste to add to other foods and put into doughs. Have you ever tried using the fruits?
No, I'd love to have a go using them because it's great at the moment, isn't it? Anything we can get from our gardens to have a go with, I think we've got the time, so it's a fantastic thing to do. But I might have to wait a few years, I think, for that to mature and do really well and get a good harvest to have a go.
Yeah, fantastic. Charlotte, how about you? What would you suggest?
Sort of similar with the fruit idea. I like crab apples. I think they're a lovely choice for a small garden. You get that beautiful blossom in the spring, you get the lovely fruits later on, and the autumn colour is really nice. So they're a good broad crowned tree as well, so really good for kind of birds perching and nesting. And then I think my other option would be something that's maybe not as obvious as a wildlife friendly plant. So goat willow, Salix caprea. I have the small pendular version, Kilmarnock, in a pot in my garden, and that's a really small tree. But the standard goat willow goes to about 8 meters in the garden, quite a bushy tree, can be just a large shrub. But those catkins in the spring are fantastic for bees, and the leaves are loved by the caterpillars. So a really nice one for all round wildlife.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that Kilmarnock willow, I mean, we used to grow it when I was working in nurseries from the age of sort of 13 or so. We used to grow it and graft it. And it is a really peculiar plant because essentially it wants to be a rather horizontal grower. It's almost got vertigo in terms of horticulture, hasn't it? So we graft it onto a tall stem, which means that you can get it at different heights.
That's the one. So I've got a really small version in my garden because it is just a terrace yard in a pot, but you can get it top grafted at sort of 6 foot or even more than that. So you could get a really nice sort of standard specimen, but without managing what could potentially be quite a big tree if you just went for the standard species.
And of course, it's dead easy to look after as well. It likes lots of different soils, very hardy. If you've got heavy, wet clay, I mean, it's a willow, so it really does prosper.
Yeah, and seasonality as well. Those catkins, even when they're slowly developing in the spring, are really pretty on the bare stems. The foliage looks really luscious in the summer, and then it does have some autumn colour before it drops as well. So you get kind of good interest all the way through the year.
Yeah, and for anyone who's interested in giving it a bit of winter interest too, you can put a little light underneath it. If you've got a little LED, solar light, something like that, uplighted in the winter, and it looks magical. You know, open the curtains on a sort of dark evening, and suddenly you've got this sort of almost ghostly object in the garden. It's really quite a beautiful sculpture, and it's fallen out of favour as well. It's one of those plants that was around, you know, was very prolific in the 80s and 90s, and then really has kind of lost favour. But you know, it's great suggestion, because we very often do forget that actually a lot of those plants with catkins are great for wildlife. How about Helen? What would you add to that list?
Well, we've had some really great choices already, but I'm going to throw in a couple that I think people won't necessarily associate with trees. The first one is holly, often grown as maybe a shrub or as a hedging plant, but actually if you allow it to grow tall, it can easily get to 7 or 8 meters. And of course, you know, fills a real sort of gap in the garden border if you're trying to perhaps get a bit of a screen. And really the sort of things that it will do for wildlife, there's an entire list of them. So the flowers there, I've got a really big specimen of holly in my garden at home, and at the moment the flowers are absolutely buzzing with all sorts of bees. There must be somebody local with a beehive, because I've got quite a lot of honeybees showing a lot of interest, but there's small bumblebees and solitary bees. And quite a lot of flies will be interested in the flowers at this time of year. And we often forget, because we think about holly as being a real berrying plant, but actually flowers are a really valuable source of nectar and pollen at the moment. If you can get a female form, then yes, those flowers will go on to turn into wonderful berries, which are loved by blackbirds and thrushes. And of course, in the winter, we get the sort of what we call the winter thrushes, things like redwings and fieldfares coming into gardens and just sort of devouring any sort of fruit that they can find in there, and that's a real treat to watch. And then my other tree is also an evergreen, so again a really useful sort of plant to have in a garden, and that's the strawberry tree. So this is best if you've got a soil which is perhaps a little bit on the acid side. So if you can grow rhododendrons and camellias, this is a good one for you. Strawberry tree lives up to its name by not only having rather attractive little lantern type flowers, but the fruits resemble little strawberries. I don't know, has anybody else tried eating those? I know, Chris, you're all up for, you know, having a bit of home foraging, but yeah, they're actually they're a bit pappy, but yeah, quite sweet and pleasant to taste.
They are. I mean, it's a great tree, and I think that it has a beautiful elegance to it. The thing I like with it is that it will grow as a multi-stem as well as a single stem tree. So you can keep it more shrub-like, or for a smaller garden, keep it a little bit more contained. But also don't be afraid to kind of lift the skirt on it, do a bit of crown lifting and expose those legs, because the bark on it is really super. It's got a very kind of soft tissuey bark that peels away in a kind of russet red colour. So it's really quite characterful. But you mentioned the fruits and eating the fruits. When I was working in Southern Ireland, where it grows wild in some of the hillsides there, we were harvesting them and eating them. And your reference to pappy is just a fantastic description, because that is exactly, they're not succulent. It is quite dry. It's almost like eating a kind of wet polystyrene, which is not, admittedly not doing it as a sales pitch, and it does have a peculiar flavour. So strawberry tree, it does look a bit strawberry-like, but doesn't taste much like a strawberry. But it's a great tree to have in a garden, especially where it's just slightly more mild. And I think the hollies are fabulous, especially for kind of dark, challenging, more dry conditions, you know, where the soil perhaps is a little bit impoverished. Those are exactly the conditions, particularly if you go for an aquifolium type. Those are the conditions that those sorts of trees really love. And there is nothing, to me, there's nothing better than waking up to the sound of a thrush or a blackbird singing. And in fact, my childhood was characterized by the sound of a blackbird sitting in a holly tree outside of my window on a summer's evening when I was going to bed, singing its heart out and just warbling and warbling away. It's just a beautiful, beautiful sound. And of course, the holly tree is great at attracting the thrushes and the mistle thrushes, the redstarts, as you say, and the blackbirds too. So yeah, real favourite. I think that's a great suggestion. Okay, so let's have another question. So this is from Mr. Franklin's, which is very formal. Mr. Franklin's from Surrey. And he said, I'd like to add a wildlife pond to my garden, but don't know where to start. Can the advice team give me ideas on the best location, the best method of construction, and any tips on general pond establishment and planting? And it sounds as though what's missing off the end of that question is, could you pop round and actually install it for him as well? So it's a kind of an A to Z of how and where and why to include a pond in the garden. Helen, how about you? Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so we're really lucky because we inherited a pond, but it was actually designed for fish, which meant that it had really steep sides. And that's not a great feature for wildlife. If any poor passing hedgehog falls in, if it can't get out, I'm afraid, you know, it's game over. So we spent some time sort of adapting that pond by putting in ramps and sort of getting up the planting really sort of improved. But if you're starting from scratch, that's perfect, because you can decide where to put it, how you construct it. So for me, I would try and find somewhere that's largely in the open, but don't worry if there's a bit of trees around. In fact, because birds will often use your pond for things like having a bit of a drink and a bath in, they quite enjoy having a little bit of cover close by. So if there's a bit of shrubbery or a tree close by, that's perfect as well. And then a flexible liner is probably the easiest way to create a shape that's quite natural. What you're trying to achieve is at least one shallow sloping side going into your pond so that wildlife can get in and can get out easily. And it's really in those shallow areas of a pond where the water starts to warm quite quickly in spring, and where, you know, you've got sort of a little bit of algae growing and some nice little marginal plants, things like maybe some brookline, where you get the real sort of interest going on and under the water. That's where most of the life is, in the shallows rather than the really deep bits. So yeah, flexible liner, you can get butyl, and essentially what you can do is just play around a little bit with the shape. It doesn't have to be a big pond either, it can be quite small and it will still attract wildlife. Essentially, there's no excuse for not having a pond in the garden in my book. And then maintenance of it, a real sort of winning tip here is, if you can at all possible, top up with rainwater rather than tap water. Tap water introduces quite a lot of nutrients, and then people start to get a bit worried when there's maybe blanket weed and algae growing in there. A bit of that's normal, so, you know, don't lose any sleep over it. I've got lots in my pond, so, you know, don't worry. But yeah, if you want to start off on the right foot, I would say top up with rainwater. And if the levels, you know, sort of come and go a little bit as the summer, you know, we're in a dry spell at the moment, that too is normal, and wildlife, you know, is sort of adapted for that. And then let nature find your pond. I know probably some of us are of a generation where we might have gone down to the local, you know, sort of wildlife pond with a jam jar and bring back a whole load of tadpoles, but best if you don't do that, because you might inadvertently bringing some sort of disease into your beautiful new pond, or even some invasive plants or animals. So yeah, just let wildlife find it, and it really will do. Frogs will get there within the first year. Flying things like sort of pond skaters could be there in a couple of days.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, how we obsess about having a kind of beauty of a pond, whether it's formal or informal. And to be honest, wildlife doesn't mind whether it's a formal pond or an informal pond, as long as you say you've got that kind of sloping side. So there's kind of accessibility and interaction with the watercourse and wildlife. But we want it to happen overnight. And I think one of the real golden rules with creating a pond in a garden is just be patient. And as you say, if you get the position right, so not too much sun, not too much shade, not too many leaves falling in, deciduous leaves falling into it, and get the formwork right. So you've got a series of shelves, different depths that you can plant at, and also that you have the volume of water as well, so that you can really create a kind of an ambient temperature, so the water isn't getting superheated on a day, when it's very hot, or very cold and freezing solid in the winter. Get all of those right, and wildlife will come. And it's almost a sort of misconception that the frogs and newts, the toads, need the water all the time. In fact, they'll walk, several hundred meters to get to a water course. They will find it. And very often, anyone who's gardened for a length of time, you can have an old compost bag that's got a bit of moisture on it, but tucked behind the greenhouse, and you go to clear away, and suddenly you see that there's frogs and toads in and around, just sort of hiding and sheltering underneath. So you're right, they will just find it. And I think get that idea of a crossover of habitats too. So to make sure that the water course is really crossing as many different forms of the garden as you can. If you've got an area of grassland, if you've got an area of gravel, if you've got an area, maybe the vegetable garden, bit of shrubbery, bit of herbaceous perennials, the garden pond should really be the kind of hub of the garden. And I'm absolutely with you that no garden should really be without water, even just the smallest body of water. My first garden, little terraced house, I had a pond that was about 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, and it was packed full of wildlife. Everything was just migrating towards it. It really brings a sense of life and vibrancy to the garden.
Yeah, maybe ponds should come with a bit of a warning that they are totally addictive. So if you put one in, that's it. Your any spare time you have is going to be lost just by sort of sitting next to it. And yeah, it's scary just how many hours I've wasted next to my pond.
Yeah, it is a great waste of pond, and a waste of life, waste of time, I should say, creating a pond in the garden. What I was going to say is that there's plenty of advice on how to go about constructing a pond on the RHS website as well, and also the range of plants that are available, because it is key to get the right plants in the right position, the right depth, and to make sure that your plants aren't over vigorous or aren't going to underperform. So turn to the RHS website, because there's plenty of information there. Anything anyone else wants to throw in at this point about ponds, experiences of ponds in the garden, good or bad?
I was going to throw in a mention of bird baths, actually, because I know we can't all get a pond in, or don't have the time to do it, but providing some sort of water for a bird bath is so easy. And every day I'm surprised what comes and takes a bath. We've got like a baby robin at the moment, and I've got a huge pigeon that comes and sits in the bird bath, and most of the water then it sloshes out as he flaps around. But the only problem is the pigeon leaves the scum. And Helen had a reason why that happens, why pigeons leave the scum but a robin doesn't.
Yeah, now don't quote me on this, but I believe that pigeons don't have preening glands. So instead their feathers get oiled by this sort of waxy white material that comes out. And of course, it's a bit like pigeon dandruff when they're having a bath in your bird bath, Leigh. I'm afraid, yeah, they probably will leave a bit of a scum. So yeah, they're not very good at cleaning up.
I just clean the bath after they've been in.
It's an interesting concept. Charlotte, how about you? Do you have cleaner pigeons up in Harrogate?
Being in a south-facing terrace, I kind of struggle to get any water to stay in the garden for longer than about 10 minutes in this weather. But one of our colleagues did a lovely video on social media a couple of weeks ago about drinking stations for pollinators, simple as a saucer with some marbles in. So that's as far as I've got in my yard at the moment, but I would quite like to try a sink or a trough pond. I'll just have to find a relatively cool spot to site it in. But even the smallest terrace can try, or even a balcony could try providing a little pot of water for your wildlife.
And of course, one of the things which is mesmeric in the creation of garden, especially if you do have a small garden or a courtyard where there's a plethora of hard landscape materials, is the sound of flowing water. So if you can put either a little bubble fountain, or if you can get water to cascade, even from a very simple construction, then that really adds a sense of character and atmosphere. And the south-facing terrace, especially the weather we've been having recently, there's nothing more cooling than listening to the sound of a bit of flowing and trickling water.
Lovely.
You can create your own Villa Lante, or the Gardens of Tivoli, or whatever it is in Harry. We'll be paying to come and see it. Honestly, it'd be great. Okay, so let's move on from that one to a more general question, actually. So, and this is from an anonymous contributor, and this one says, I have 4 young children who love to play outside in the garden. I'd like to make the garden more wildlife friendly, but have some safety concerns over ponds that we've been talking about, and potentially harmful plants in the garden while the children are playing. How can I minimize the risks and still enjoy wildlife? So should we be worried about the range of plants that we're putting in? Leigh, what do you think?
This is always an interesting question, because we get lots of people who do ring us and go, is this poisonous? Is that poisonous? And yes, there are plants out there that are potentially harmful. I think it's understanding both what plants are potentially harmful, but also about kind of what your risk is as well. So first of all, we have a list on the RHS website that you can check. Some plants are just irritant, others are poisonous, but you've often got to eat them or ingest them. Plant toxicity is different for pets and for different pets than it is for humans. So if it's poisonous to us, it might not be to your dog, so you'll need to look at the separate lists as well. But I think at that point, I'm often wondering, does your dog or child browse their way through their borders? Because if they're not basically going through eating everything, which some children do, but then you might not have such a risk anyway. So therefore, having a wider range of plants might be fine. But I think the point to think about is, are the children at a point where you can begin to educate them, sort of say, oh yes, this euphorbia has white sap, don't get that on you. Or yes, foxgloves are lovely, but don't eat them because they're poisonous. But look at the bees and kind of point out, because certainly the way I grew up, I don't remember very many plants being removed apart from the laburnum. But it was kind of part of the rich tapestry of the world, and the world as we go out our front door is not always the perfect safe bubble that we live in, but it can be a very beautiful place. So actually kind of beginning that journey into life can start in the garden. But I think if there are any critical things you're worried about, then go back to the list and consider that risk carefully.
And I completely agree, actually, that education is all part of the enjoyment of gardening. And I never remember being in a garden where plants were removed. My grandparents and any people I was working for always took the time to say, actually, this plant grows like this, and you just need to be careful because look at the fine hairs. Get a magnifying glass on something like an arbutelon, and you can see the fine hairs and the way that they could enter the skin and become an irritant. And so I think, in a way, the more we engage with children and the more we tell them about the plethora of plant material that's out there and how wonderful the world of plants is, and the more we can build stories around plants as well. And very often some of the folklore attached to plants is telling us something about the toxicity of the plant or the way that the plant was used historically. It's a great opportunity. Those of you who know your Shakespeare, it's a great opportunity to go through some of Shakespeare's works and just look at some of the toxins and poisons that are referenced in Shakespeare, and then look to see what's growing in the hedgerows and gardens. So try and use it as an opportunity to get people involved in the garden and to discuss, how and why we're growing particular plants. And as you say, the vast majority are relatively benign if they're used appropriately. And we were doing some work some years ago now with schools gardens, and I tried to find a list of plants that were approved for school gardens, and nobody was prepared to publish a list of plants that are actually approved for school gardens, or in fact those plants that aren't approved for school gardens. And you mentioned laburnum, and I mean laburnum, of course, wonderful yellow racemes, just and when I was growing up, the streets were full of laburnums, and they've gradually been taken away or have just died out and haven't really been replanted, and it now is considered to be a plant not to use. But I was doing some research, and there's never been a recorded case of anybody dying of laburnum poisoning in the UK. So sickness, yes, but not from dying of it. So in a way, we need to kind of temper it and just think about how genuinely dangerous is this plant, and how can we actually take those steps, as you say, to just make it a more exciting place to live.
You're absolutely right. We often look at the hospital information that we're given, and although the toxicity might be known, there's very few cases that are actually recorded. And as you're saying about laburnum, it might have been the tree that was removed, but certainly from going to places like Bostock with that amazing laburnum arch that goes on for many hundreds of feet. That was one of the inspiring things going to gardens that kind of make you want to garden. So yeah, don't exclude things. It can lead on a wonderful path.
Yeah, absolutely.
When it comes to wildlife.
How about Helen and Charlotte? What about the issue of water in the garden? We were talking previously about ponds, and clearly there is a danger with the creation of ponds and children. How would you go about ensuring that we can get the water, we can get the wildlife in, but the water course is safe? What suggestions might you have?
So I think, Charlotte, you already touched on that really good little video that a colleague's done about some of the, like, pond in a pot, or a little pebble fountain, or marbles with, just as a little bee drinker. And all those are great to have, even with very young kids, in the garden. You don't need to be without water. I mean, we know just how much children love, to look at, put their hands in, and so, yeah, there are very safe ways that you can have water in a garden with a young family. And then really, as they grow up and become more familiar, then you can start to think about maybe swapping out that sand pit for a small little wildlife pond, maybe getting children involved in making frog homes, or just sort of really getting part of the process of encouraging wildlife into your garden. I was just thinking also, a worry that a lot of families might have is around bees and wasps in the garden, and about, okay, if we're planting things to encourage them, is that going to put my children at greater risk? And again, it's, yeah, of course, like with the potentially poisonous plants, there are risks in a garden, but I think introducing children to wildlife at a really young age, and just getting them to be excited but sensible around it. So recognizing what stripes on an animal might mean, getting them to perhaps look at rather than touch bees and wasps, and just trying to calm some of those sort of reactions that they might pick up in the playground or whatever, about, it's a wasp, sort of, if you can get that interest and excitement but sensible approach to wildlife from a really young age, it's going to make their lives better. There's nothing worse than starting out in life with a fear of your environment and of something. So yeah, I don't know, Charlotte, have you got any tips there?
I think I would say, if you really are nervous about the planting and potentially encouraging that amount of wildlife in, start with something really small and easy. I put a really small solitary bee hotel on my terrace wall this year. I've got 5 bees nesting in it already. And just as Helen said with her pond, it is mesmerizing to watch them go in and out. You could position it quite high, so you're not necessarily close to the bees, but teaching children about what they're doing in the bee house and how important that is. A log pile or a big bug hotel, you'd be encouraging frogs, you'd be encouraging lots of different types of ground invertebrates. You might even get, sort of mice and that kind of thing. it's really exciting to go and have a look and see what you are actually providing wildlife to in a really safe, easy way to do at home. And the actual building of the bug hotel or the bee hotel is a fun activity to do as well. You don't need anything particularly technical. And so if you are worried about it in a wider sense, just try something really small to begin with, and you'll find it so satisfying, even just that one little change.
And you mentioned the bees and the nature of people being frightened of bees, and I think Helen's absolutely right to try and remove that kind of flinching instinct we have as soon as you hear anything buzzing around you when you're sitting outside and enjoying a summer's day. But with some of the insects that you can introduce into the garden, there's actually they have no interest in coming anywhere near you. And if you want to introduce bees into the garden in a very safe format, masonry bees are very good. There are lots of companies who will actually send you a little package, a little house, a masonry bee house, and you can put that into the garden. They're fantastic pollinators, but apparently they don't sting at all. And at the end of the season, once they've gone through their life and laid a series of eggs, you can then send that back to the company and they will send you a new batch the following year. So you've always got a kind of mini beehive, which is about a third of the size of a shoebox. It's completely safe. And as you say, you've got that opportunity for children to get involved and to really demonstrate how wonderful the interaction is between our plants and our wildlife. Because in a way, we're all horticulturalists and we're sort of fascinated with the world of plants, but the world of plants is a relatively benign place without the world of insects and all of the other animals and so on that come into the garden. It's that, in a way, is what brings our gardens to life, is that union of this sort of wonderful array of creatures that can descend even into the smallest of spaces. Even a windowsill or a single plant sitting on a balcony will bring something in that you'll be able to get pleasure from. So yes, I think education for me is the absolute key. Get children involved, teach them, and don't be afraid yourself, because very often as a parent, if you flinch, then that's conveying a message to the child. So sometimes we have to overcome our own fears in order to be able to ensure that our children won't then portray exactly the same fears. But yeah, great advice. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's move on. So this one is a little bit more general. This is from Jenny Hayes in southeast London. She said, I'd like to reduce my environmental impact while gardening. I've started to reduce my plastic use, but could the team suggest other ways I could reduce my environmental footprint in the garden? Charlotte, what do you think? What do you do in your garden? What would you advise that we do?
So as I say, I've got a really small terrace yard, but even just in there's a few ways that you can make a difference. So I have a water butt running from my downpipe, which is a great way to water your plants, but it's also really environmentally friendly, that water harvesting, and particularly important in places like London where you're prone to kind of hose pipe bans during dry weather. And I also have a compost bin, and I think composting can sometimes be quite a daunting sort of idea. People think you need a really big garden. I have a compost bin in a yard with no grass, with no resident kind of shrubs and trees, and in a really small 2-person household. And I can fill the compost bin really easily. It's really satisfying to watch it go down. All my kitchen waste, all my garden waste goes straight in there, and I get something to use at the end of it, which is nice and rich for my plants. And in doing so, it means I'm buying less compost, which, although we've obviously made really important steps recently into the peat free, which in itself is a fantastic thing to be doing, they are distributed, they're transported on the road, they're normally packed in plastic. So if you can make compost at home yourself, that's a fantastic way and a really tangible environmental benefit.
No, great idea. And also, I think the point that you can make compost even in the smallest of spaces. I think, as you're absolutely right. Very often people think that it's about large gardens and large estates that need a compost heap, and actually we can all do it in the smallest of spaces. Interesting to know you're doing it without it being in contact with the soil as well. What sort of compost bin are you using?
I've got a hot composter positioned in my nice sunny garden. So at the moment we're getting to about 40 degrees in there. So it composts really, really quickly. And literally I can put a caddy from the kitchen in. Within the space of a few days, the level's gone down and it needs another caddy to fill it up. So if you're a multi-person household, if you've got kids, you're using lots of fruit and vegetables, it's a fantastic option for not having to send that to landfill. But it will also survive on simple prunings, a few fallen leaves in the autumn, and annual weeds, which I'm forever pulling out of my block paving. all of that goes straight in there. It means I'm not popping it in my black waste bin or even in my green waste recycling, which again is a great thing that the councils offer, but it's still collected in a van, it's still transported. If you can do all of that in your own garden, it's as environmentally friendly as you can get.
Yeah, perfect. And I would add actually that if you have the space, get yourself a chicken or some chickens, because in terms of composting and recycling, there's very little that chickens won't eat. And what comes out the back end of a chicken can be added to your hot compost heap, makes it good and rich, and then you can put that back onto your beds and borders. So they're sort of completing the cycle there. Leigh, how about you? What would you add to our idea of becoming a little bit more environmentally friendly?
Very much watching your water use. Gardeners can use a lot of water at times, particularly when we've had very dry spells. And of course, we've had a lot of rain over winter, and now the rain has stopped. So I suspect we're all beginning to use quite a lot of water for our gardens, particularly as we've all been growing perhaps more from seed and getting out and doing containers like Charlotte too. Obviously, it's not the perfect time to do this, but as Charlotte said, getting in water butts to collect the rain that we do get is really helpful. And even off a standard sort of shed roof, about 6 by 8, we worked out you should be quite easily able to fill 6 water butts over the winter. And we do seem to need to store quite a lot of water. And that's going to be the change going forward with generally sort of hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters. So we'll need to collect and store the water for use over summer. The other way, of course, of storing that water is by storing it in the ground. So all that compost that you make, not only is it a brilliant way of capturing the carbon on site and putting it back into the ground, so storing the carbon in the soil, but all that organic matter will hold on to more moisture. So yes, it could be dug in, but if you can put it on as a layer of mulch around established plants as well, that will prevent so much evaporation. So anything we can do to kind of save it to use it, because the other thing that plants do brilliantly for us in summer is they do release moisture, and that cools our local environment. So it's not just about don't use it, it's kind of save it and use it at the same time to get the full benefits that plants can provide.
It's interesting as well, you mentioned roofs and roofs of sheds and so on. It's interesting if you put a green roof onto a structure, or if you're building a structure, make sure that it has sufficient structural stability to be able to support a green roof of alpines, sempervivums, that sort of thing growing on the roof, which is what I've done over a log store. And you then have the dual benefit of not having a material which is reflecting the sun's heat and heating the atmosphere, so that that's keeping it nice and cool. But we're keeping plants alive. So you then got the idea of pollinating insects coming in. Some of the sempervivums and sedums are great at attracting pollinating insects. And then the water gradually trickles out and is then collected in a series of water butts. And so there are, in a way, areas that we can join up the dots, where we can have wildlife friendly plants, we can reduce the temperature of our buildings, we can create greater insulation during the winter if you're putting it onto a residential building, but also you're slowing the transition of water down and reducing flooding, but making water available for the garden. And I think one of the things that gardeners should really be campaigning for is that new houses are built with not only green roofs, but also groundwater harvesting tanks, that actually everything which is coming off of our surfaces, whether it's a terrace or whether it's roofs, should really be fed into groundwater harvesting tanks, so we can then pump out of that into to service our gardens. It's certainly a step that's very easy to make, and yet would make a huge difference to the way that the water cycle in our garden works. And I certainly support the idea of mulching and putting lots of organic matter into the soil, because that of course locks in the moisture into the soil. So yeah, I think that's great tips there. Helen, how about you? What would you suggest to make sure that we're ticking the right environmental boxes?
Those are great ideas already. I think the tip I would add, which is really simple and really cheap to do, I've got a bigger garden perhaps than Charlotte and Leigh. I live in a rural bit of South Warwickshire, and one of the biggest sort of efforts I have to put in is on weed control. So what I do is save any sort of cardboard packaging that I get from, we're all having a lot of deliveries at the moment. So rather than that just going straight into recycling, I save that, open it out, and then put that down onto, I've got some fruit beds which have bushes in, so that the bits of soil in between those bushes, I don't really want to grow anything, I just want to keep it weed free. So I put this cardboard down onto the soil surface, and then over the top of it, as the sort of summer months come on, I start doing a bit of mowing, and any grass clippings, some of it goes onto the compost heap, which is great to sort of activate it and get things really moving there. But any surplus clippings, I just literally tip out onto the surface of the cardboard. And in the autumn, that might be mixed a little bit with some dead leaves, as the autumn leaves come down as well, and it hides the cardboard. If I can, I sort of pull off some of the tape, the packaging tape that it comes with. But even if that doesn't sort of easily come off, after a few months of the cardboard rotting down, it's the tape sort of lifts itself, and it's easy just to collect and pop in the bin. But it's a really great way to reduce the amount of weed killers you have, or even just the effort of weeding beds and borders. It works best on sort of shrub borders and fruit beds where you don't want to be doing a lot of planting. But yeah, it's just a nice way. And also, I'm not buying these sort of woven polypropylene type ground control membranes and things as well. This is a really nice biodegradable sort of mulch that can be used. So I think anybody can do that, even in a small space.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that there's a general hesitancy over the use of papers and cardboards in the garden. I've heard lots of people worrying about the toxicity of inks and glues. You mentioned the tape that sometimes is used to bind cardboard boxes together. What would your advice be in terms of the types of cardboards and papers that are most appropriate?
I think certainly if you have got a lot of writing or ink or a lot of plastics on it, it's probably not worth using those. Maybe just do your normal sorting in recycling and send that off for professional use. But if it's a fairly sort of plain bit of cardboard, if it's not got a lot of ink on it, and some of the inks these days are going to be sort of plant-based inks anyway, so that they will be naturally degradable. And then it's just really about sort of playing it a bit by ear. I know that however careful I am at getting tape off, I'm going to miss a few bits, so I do go back through. I don't want to be littering bits of plastic in the garden. But the soil is actually a great natural sorter and sort of sieve anyway, and things often sort of rise to the surface where you can just pick it off, even if it's a few months down the line. So if you invest in your soil, get organic matter into there, whether it's your home compost or some soil improver, you're going to actually have a very healthy sort of microbe and soil community that can break down some of these things that come in packaging anyway. So yeah, it's just about sort of being sensible with it. But it's worked well in my garden, and the fact that I'm not having to sort of use weed killers and not having to use a lot of plastic mulchers, I think that's a win.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think as a general rule, if the cardboard has got this is a recycled cardboard sticker on it or badge on it, then you're probably safe to use it in the garden. And it's interesting, Bob Flowerdew, who I work with on Radio 4's Gardener Question Time, I asked him, what would you not put into your compost heap? And in answer, he just said, nothing. He composts everything. Now, obviously, there are some things that we need to be a little bit careful of. I would hesitate suggesting that people put babies' nappies and cat litter trays and those sorts of things in for obvious sort of toxicity reasons. But he always maintains that if you get a compost heap hot enough and it's a healthy compost heap, there's actually very little that's of organic matter origin that won't rot down given the right time and the right conditions. So it's about being sensible, isn't it, with your choice. But that's a great suggestion of using the cardboard and then covering it with leaf litter and grass clippings. I might well try that. I have some raspberries and gooseberries that I'm forever pulling weeds out of. I might go home and just give that one a go. Right. Okay. Let's move on. So we've got this is another anonymous. There's a lot of shy people out there who aren't prepared to tell us who they are. However, this is an anonymous one, and I'd like to said I would like to transfer around 20 meters, 20 square meters of lawn into a wildflower meadow. Would you advise removing the existing turf and sowing meadow seed, or inserting plug plants into the existing lawn? Any tips on timings, establishment and maintenance? Much appreciated. So it sounds like it's a fairly conventional, close mown, scalped, pretty sort of monocrop lawn, looking for some advice on how to make it a little bit more floriferous and a bit more interesting in terms of wildlife. Helen, what do you think? What would you suggest in this circumstance?
Yeah, so this is a real question of the moment, isn't it? I think there's been a lot in sort of social media over the last couple of summers about sort of wildflowers, and we all want a bit of the action, really, and there's really no reason why not to. So if you've already got a lawn like this person has, rather than just sort of stripping that off straight away and you know, going in with something new, I think it's quite nice just to see, okay, what's actually there. So my advice would be stop mowing for a summer and just see what turns up. Is it just a sea of grass? If it is, then yeah, I would be tempted then to say, right, there's not a lot that's going to really be salvageable here. Let's strip that off, and either in the autumn or in the spring, so a nice wildflower mix. You go to specialist companies, they will do seed mixes that are suitable for different soil types. And I would, for gardeners, recommend going with what's called 100% wildflower mix. That means it's not got any grasses in the mix, so you're more likely to get a nice display and selection of wildflowers getting established. Don't worry about the grasses, they will come of their own accord over time. You don't need to actually introduce those in the seed mix. However, if after stopping mowing for a bit, you think, oh, actually, that's interesting, I didn't know that I had a bit of hawkweed or a bit of, you know, sort of, there's some daisies there, or maybe some self-heal, you know, just some flower interest anyway. And if you've got that and the grass isn't too lush, I'd say keep the grass and go with plug planting. I think that's a really nice way to play it. You can buy little mini wildflower plug plants, and if you sort of pop these into the grass in the autumn or the spring, mow it really close so that they don't have a lot of competition, and then maybe plant them in nice natural looking drifts, and just play. Over the years you can keep adding a bit more. And there's a really super little native wildflower called yellow rattle, which is one of the only plants that I would recommend sowing into an existing lawn or into existing grass. If you can get your seed really fresh, usually at the end of summer, August or September, you mow your lawn really close, you give it a good scarify, you know, get out any pent up anger and give it a good rake. That will sort of get you down to a little bit of patchy soil. Sow the yellow rattle seeds. It's a little annual, it's semi-parasitic on grass, and what happens is that if that gets going, it won't kill your grass, but it will just help suppress its growth so that your lovely wildflowers have a chance of getting going.
It's remarkable as well, isn't it, how parasitic yellow rattle is. If you see two patches adjacent to one another, one which has got the yellow rattle in and one that doesn't, it will halve even the most vigorous of lawn grasses.
Yeah, it's really noticeable. Yeah, it's such a great tool to have in a, you know, a sort of wildflower mix. You can buy mixes which have it already built in, but yeah, that's a fantastic one just to get started. And although it's an annual, if it gets established, it will self-seed and then just gradually, you know, sort of spread itself around your lawn. So yeah, I would try that.
And sowing it fresh is absolutely the key. In my experience, if you can sow it in autumn, literally as it would be falling out of the seed pods on the plant into that scarified ground. I like the idea of you taking your anger out on the lawn with a rake, sort of earnestly going away at the soil, bearing patches, giving us plenty of naked soil in which to sow the seed. That's the perfect time to do it, isn't it? Before the onset of the winter colds. Charlotte, how about you? Now, you sound as though you haven't got much of a space for lawns, but what would you suggest in this situation in terms of plants that might be added, or continuing the theme of ensuring that a naked lawn is converted into something which is a bit more floriferous?
I think I'd say don't forget bulbs. So lots of people with wildflowers only think about the actual seed mixtures, but so many bulbs are pollinator friendly, give you some interest in the spring, perhaps before most of your main wildflowers have really got going. And if they're naturalized, so you literally just throw the bulbs down and plant them where they land, they will add a lovely burst of colour and extend the season. I'd also say, in my experience, lots of people are a bit nervous that going for a kind of grassy meadow will look really messy. And I've worked in a few gardens where they've mown the edges and then each year chosen a few paths to mow through the area. And that makes it look like a really intentional design feature of your garden. And it's also really fun. You can kind of walk through, maybe mow a little circle in the centre where you can sort of put your picnic rug down and immerse yourself in your wildflower meadow. And that will make it look like a very sort of intentional part of your garden rather than an area that you've just kind of let go wild.
I think that's a great tip, actually. I love the idea of scattering the bulbs and just allowing them to naturalize. One of the most difficult things as gardeners, I think, is to actually plant any form of plant and make it look as though nature has allowed it to prosper in its own colony or community. We're all a bit too methodical and a bit too mathematical in the way that we put it. We try very earnestly to make it look informal. And an old lecturer of mine, when I was at Pershore College, he always said the best way of doing it is to scalp your turf. So lift the area of turf that you're going to plant your bulbs in, fill your bulbs, mix the various species together in a bucket, stand with your back to the area you want to plant, and then just throw the bucket over your shoulder and plant the bulbs wherever they land, which is a sort of, you need to be fairly good with your practice in throwing buckets, but it's a great way of just making sure that we don't end up with a too formulaic an approach to that naturalization.
Yeah, and that applies to the plug plants as well. So obviously they're a little more fragile, so don't give them a really good wallop across the area. But if you're kind of sort of dropping them, rather than going, if you've got a mixed tray, rather than taking each individual species and try and sort of place them round, if you sort of get a mixed handful and sort of kind of walk through and drop them and plant them there, it will look so much more like nature intended, rather than you've been too careful to have a red one in each zone of your wildflower bed or whatever. So yeah, definitely don't be too, if you throw it and it looks like you've got a big patch of one, then you could always disperse it slightly. But definitely better to kind of give it a light tossing and see where it lands.
I like the idea of the folks of Harrogate throwing bulbs at one another to create an informal look about their naturalised bulbs in the lawns. I think that's a great way of doing it. Leigh, have you got anything to add to that? What about the range of plants that we might be throwing into this plug planting list? Anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, funny enough, I was inspired recently because I went past what was a very suburban street but went out onto fields. And somehow that didn't feel very appropriate, in the sense that all these very clipped, tightly manicured plants. But one gardener had obviously had a poor lawn, they had stripped it off, and they just sown lots of oxeye daisies. And of course, at this time, when they're absolutely just beginning to open up, it was stunning. If you wanted envy from the neighbours, that was the way to go, because it was basically mass planting. But in amongst all that was other things to come. So there were fine grasses, but there were quite a lot of hawk bits. So in a way, it can be horticulturally top-notch, kind of inspiring stuff as well. It's not just all of wildlife.
Sometimes just being a bit more relaxed about the way that we garden is a great way forwards. And as we were just hearing, mowing paths through the lawns, that's exactly what you see. Christopher Lloyd really kind of pioneered that idea of just allowing things to be a little bit more perhaps scruffy around the edges, a bit more informal, perhaps would be a better way of describing it. And the idea of daisies, I think the oxeye daisies, when one of the gardens that I worked in some years ago, there was a large area of lawn that was being regularly scalped. This time of year, twice a week was being scalped. And we just encouraged the clients to prevent the gardener from going in and mowing. And what came through was the most amazing clumps of daisy, just the normal lawn daisy. But over a period of weeks, what emerged were the daisies were actually in straight lines. And so as the lawn started to grow through, you had straight lines of daisies. And it was previously a Victorian tennis court. And of course, because daisies like slightly more limey conditions, they were liming the lines of the tennis court onto a lawn. And that had persisted in the ground long enough so that once we stopped mowing, we had the perfect tennis court defined by lawn daisies, which was just the most extraordinary thing to see. And of course, they colonize across the lawn eventually, but it just relax a little sometimes, I think, in a garden. Okay, so this one is from East Sussex, actually. This is Johnny Fairclough, who says, hello, advisors. I have recently moved to a new house which has nearly an acre of garden simply laid to lawn with no trees, shrubs or other plants in it at all. I'd like to encourage wildlife, a variety of wildlife, but find starting the garden a daunting task. The garden is mainly surrounded by fields, but has a wooded area on one boundary. Any tips to get started? I mean, this sounds to me as though it's not going to take long for wildlife to come in, you know, if you've got countryside around and woodland, all the right ingredients are there. Helen, how should we go about turning a kind of naked lawn of an acre into a wildlife reserve? What would be your first steps?
The first thing to realise is that any sort of gardening is wildlife gardening, whether you know it or not. That if you start putting plants in there and creating these different habitats within a garden, you know, wildlife will find a space for it. So don't necessarily think you've got to do anything really different and become a, you know, some sort of you know, gamekeeper, you know, extraordinaire in your garden just to be able to, you know, get in a blackbird or two. So my first tip would be to first of all decide what you want to have in a new garden. If it's important for you to have an outside seating area, maybe with a barbecue, have it. But maybe if it's a sunny spot, rather than it being, you know, sort of chock-a-block paving, have some gaps in there to have nice thymes or marjoram, or maybe some little chives, things that actually bringing all the pollinators, and you know, it's working for both you but also for wildlife as well. I think in this setting it sounds really lovely that it's going out onto more naturalistic, you know, sort of wood, there's a bit of woodland perhaps, and you know, the fields. So perhaps as you move closer to those areas, go with a bit more, you know, maybe one of those wildflower meadows that we've just been talking about, you know, would look more nice, you know, sort of as it transitions from your more formal areas to that. And then my other really important tip is you're not alone with wildlife gardening. There's so many people out there now that are really enthused and just learning, but others will have more experience. There's some great forums if you're on Facebook. There's our Wild About Gardens group, there's the Wildlife Gardening Forum community, and they're just packed with people who are willing to share their experiences and their advice. So I think that would be quite a nice thing to do to give you a bit more confidence and some ideas.
And I think also just make sure that you bite off a small enough chunk so you can formalize this. If you've got an acre, it's a large garden of lawn, you want to sort of garden that intensely, take a small area and deal with that first and let the grass grow up in other areas, and define the garden by where you want to sit. I think very often as gardeners, we become slightly obsessive about the doing rather than the enjoying. And actually, I think very often a garden can really be laid out beautifully if you just put a post in the ground in every position you'd like to sit, every view, the sunset, the sound of water, trees being buffeted by the breeze, shelter from winds, whatever it is. Find all those locations, put a bench there, and then start to craft your meadows and your orchards and your beds and vegetable gardens and so on and so on. But I think it's really important for it to allow ourselves permission to sit and relax in the garden and not get too flustered about the weeding and the stresses. Now, we're nearly out of time, but what I would like to do is just very quickly just do one more question, because this is something that I think we very often get when we're talking about wildlife gardens, and this is, again, it's an anonymous question. It says, are there any plant groups that attract pollinators and other beneficial insects that are not in the three main categories of daisy, tubular, or umbellifera? Those are the flower types that we very often refer to as being most attractive to our wildlife. So Leigh, are we missing a trick here? Is there a category of plants or a type of plant we should be looking for which doesn't fit within those three of daisy, tubular and umbel?
I might need a bit of help from Helen here, because actually she's done more research in this area than myself. Because I was actually thinking through, as you were saying, and thinking, well, most things are kind of tubes of sorts. It's just how far they open, whether they become discs or flat. So Helen, have you got any additional thoughts to help me out here?
What we found with our various trials that we've done around pollinator plants is that whatever the flower type, there's probably going to be something that will benefit from it. And in a garden, I think the key is not necessarily to be prescriptive and try and have, okay, I'm going to have one type of daisy plant, I'm going to have one type of umbellifera. It's more about the more diverse your flower types are, the more things you're likely to attract. Because even the sort of most insignificant looking flowers, you might get, you know, perhaps you've got a euonymus, a spindle bush. The flowers are really tiny, you know, you wouldn't see them at Chelsea as a big bouquet or anything like that, but actually focus in on them and there'll probably be tiny little solitary wasps or flies using them. And essentially it's about making sure you've got a good range. And also a range of things for the seasons as well, because we know that wildlife is getting active earlier in spring and staying active later in autumn and into winter. So try and see, have you got any gaps in your border that where you're lacking flowers in a month? And if so, get shopping, you know, make yourself a nice little wish list and see what you can fill in there.
And we can get really hung up on right plants to kind of bring the wildlife in. But what we know is basically the more plants that you can get in, the more wildlife that you'll get in the garden. So the more surfaces, the more plants that you get in, it's going to come anyway. So don't get too hung up. There are definitely things that you can look on, like our plants pollinators list, but overall, more the merrier.
I absolutely agree that, you know, diversity and seasonality are the two things that I would hold up there. One group of plants that we very often don't talk about in terms of being beneficial to wildlife, but certainly have their contributory factors, are the carnivorous plants. Up on the Beach Grow garden up in Aberdeen, we grow sarracenias outside in the boggy area of a pool, and of course the flowers of a sarracenia, the pitchers, are really attractive to pollinating insects. They also have the downside of catching a few insects as well, but it's sort of an interesting addition and deviation from perhaps the norm. So some great suggestions. Thank you very much. Well, we are, unfortunately, out of time, but can I just thank Leigh, Helen and Charlotte here. I think you guys have done a fantastic job. And for me, it's not just so much the information which has been portrayed, but also the enthusiasm and the knowledge base that you guys have, a really good indication of what's out there and what the RHS can offer. And as several of you said throughout the course of the session, getting in touch either via various groups, Facebook groups and so on, or going onto the RHS website, you can access this sort of pool of talent that are happy to answer your questions. And of course, under normal circumstances, would also be at the shows as well. So you would be able to speak to them in person about your gardening challenges. So thank you all very much for your contribution. Really, really super today. The topic for tomorrow's session is indoor plants. So if you've got any questions about gardening in small spaces and how to take care of your houseplants, head to the virtual Chelsea area of the RHS website and send your questions in. Now, the advice team will be joined by Telegraph columnist and author Alice Vincent and Fran Bailey, who is owner of the London indoor plant store called Forest. Now, panel, I cannot possibly let you go without asking you about the houseplants, which are secreted behind you. Charlotte, what is it that's tickling your shoulder there?
It's just an areca palm, so it's nothing particularly fancy, but I just love the leaves. I've got one in probably every room of my house at the moment. Eyeing up several more houseplants to add to the collection, despite what my husband says. But I think it's really important not just to enjoy your garden outside, but to add that tranquility inside.
I think you're doing your palm down a little bit. I think you need to celebrate it a bit more, but great to see it tucked in the corner of the room. Leigh, I can see that you have reached behind and got a specimen there. What is it you'd like to thrust under the camera?
It's begonia. No, I've got to get the right way around. Little Brother Montgomery. I'm going to get the words the wrong way around. And it's a stem cane begonia. really easy. Got it at Hampton Court, and the one little stem has made all this in the year. So yeah, I've been really pleased with this little purchase from Diddlers.
Very good. And also joining another collection. One of the things about houseplants is put them together. They're very gregarious plants, aren't they? They like to be in a community. I like the fact you've got them all kind of nestling on the shelf behind. And now, Helen, we have to take you to task here. You don't have a plant in vision. Have you got anything tucked away in the room there you'd like to tell us about?
Normally, what I would have is a great big bouquet. I love to grow cut flowers, and what I miss cutting, the bees and the other pollinators get to enjoy. But I did have a lovely bouquet of peonies, but I'm afraid they've just gone over, and the next ones aren't quite out. So I'm sorry, you've pulled me out there, Chris. I will do better next time.
Well, we'll forgive you. If you normally have a bouquet of flowers in the house, then that's entirely appropriate. Thank you all again for contributing today. Thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow, 1 o'clock.